In the mid-1700s, people everywhere survived by working the land, from China and Japan to the 13 British colonies on the North American mainland, and throughout Western Europe, which was beginning to recover from decades of famine, disease, and stagnant population growth. In the middle of the century, Western Europe enjoyed successive years of good harvests and a slowly growing population. Then, within a few decades, one European country, Britain, underwent a transformation that ended with its economy industrialized and its people a nation of city dwellers. This pattern of change was basically repeated on the European mainland, in North America, and eventually in much of the rest of the world, fundamentally changing the nature of human existence.
What stages did Britain go through in its transformation from a land of farms and farmers to a land of factories and factory workers? Why did the Industrial Revolution begin in Europe, in Britain in particular? What part did the United States play in the Industrial Revolution? What was the course of the Industrial Revolution on the European mainland and elsewhere? 18th century Europe was open to change, eager not only to conquer new worlds, but also to explore new ideas and to exploit new technologies. This dynamic motion had begun centuries earlier with the technological advances of the late Middle Ages. It was accelerated by the numerous geographical discoveries made since the end of the 15th century and by the revolution in science that had begun in the 16th century. Britain had shared in these developments without always being at their forefront. In the 17th century, the Dutch had excelled at canal building, the Germans at mining, and the French at civil engineering. But Britain had advantages that mainland Europe lacked. For one thing, it had been free for centuries from the devastation and dislocation of foreign invasion. Labor was also more widely available in Britain, where serfdom had been discarded toward the end of the Middle Ages. On the European mainland, serfs were still tied to specific estates and not free to move. In Britain, the restrictions imposed by guilds and municipal authorities were less severe than in many places on the European continent. Britain was united into one country large enough to encourage the growth and development of sizable economic enterprises, which was often not the case on the continent. In addition, since James II's overthrow and exile in 1688, Britain had lacked a strong central government, such as the one in France, which dominated the country's economic as well as its political life.
During the 60 to 70 years after 1688, all of the conditions necessary to 18th century industrialization came together. A decisive element was the economic and political power of those aristocratic families that had brought about the downfall of James II. Many aristocrats pioneered a revolution in agriculture, planting new high-energy food crops and using more efficient farming methods. Through improved breeding techniques, they increased the size of their livestock. And through their control of Parliament, they increased the size of their estates, passing laws known as enclosure acts that closed off common or public land and incorporated it into their own holdings. With increased acreage, they made their operations more efficient, providing food for a steadily growing population. Many previously independent small farmers, however, were dispossessed and left unemployed. This surplus of labor was to create a reservoir that would be drawn on later by industry. Besides farming, British aristocrats pursued various other enterprises to make money. In this respect, they differed markedly from aristocrats on the continent, who generally thought commerce beneath them. Many British aristocrats opened mines or quarries on their land, sometimes using primitive horse-drawn railways to transport the coal, stone, or ore mined. Some invested in turnpike trusts, which built toll roads. Others built canals, which often involved difficult feats of engineering in the construction of aqueducts and locks. The canals and roads provided a cheap means of transporting goods around the country, another condition essential to industrialization. British aristocrats also invested in foreign trade, making such items as tea, spices, cotton, tobacco, and hemp common sights in British ports. Through their control of Parliament, they were also able to protect their sources of trade by sending their country to war if necessary. Victories over French forces in the 1750s and 60s left trade from both North America and India largely in British hands. These trading links would later provide British factories with sources of raw materials and with markets for manufactured goods. All that was needed to set off the Industrial Revolution was a way of dramatically increasing production.
The breakthrough came in cotton clothing. Supplies of raw cotton could be obtained from both India and slave plantations in the British and French West Indies. The North American mainland, later to become the chief source of supply, did not yet produce enough for its own needs. Two inexpensive new machines were invented to speed the process of turning raw cotton into cloth. The first was the flying shuttle, which increased the width of cloth that one person could weave. The other was the spinning jenny, which allowed up to 8 threads to be spun at a time. Spinners could now keep pace with mechanized weavers. For a while, these spinners and weavers worked at home. But in 1769, a new machine was patented that soon disrupted and then eliminated the cottage clothing industry. The new machine was a spinning frame, powered first by water and later by steam. This meant that it had to be located in a mill, giving rise to the first factories of the Industrial Revolution, the large spinning mills. The first factory of this kind was Cromford Mill, near Derby. By 1780, it had 300 workers and several thousand spindles. Other inventions, such as the power loom, fed the factory system. Production soared, and mills sprang up everywhere, especially in Lancashire, a county with rivers for water power, high humidity, essential to spinning high-quality yarn, and convenient to the port of Liverpool.
By the 1820s, exports of cotton goods made up almost half of Britain's exports, providing British entrepreneurs with the capital for the next stage of the Industrial Revolution. The age of iron, coal, and steam. The iron industry had begun to flourish as early as 1709, when a method of smelting iron ore using coke was discovered. Even though the process could be used to make only cast iron and could not be adopted throughout Britain, iron output rose rapidly, with as much impact on the Industrial Revolution as textiles had. The cast iron was used in many ways, for making cannons during the Napoleonic Wars, and for such new kinds of construction as iron bridges. In 1784, a way was found to make wrought iron, which was more flexible and tougher than cast iron. As iron output rose, so did the need for coal to be used in smelting. Between 1770 and 1820, coal output trebled. The great technical problem in mining in the 18th century had been how to pump out water as the mine got deeper. At first, an engine was developed that used steam to create a vacuum to move the arm of a pump. A later model pump employed the direct power of steam rather than the force of a vacuum to drive a piston. The steam engine affected the entire course of the Industrial Revolution. By converting the up and down motion of the piston into rotary motion, which could drive ordinary machinery, it allowed steam power to replace muscle or water power in many machines and industries. The development of steam power and the rise of the iron industry reinforced each other. Steam provided vital power for hammering and rolling, the later stages of iron making. And it increased the demand for iron. Only machinery made of iron could stand up to the strains of steam power. As the use of steam power spread, industries began to spring up all over Britain, since a natural source of water power was no longer necessary.
The wide use of such heavy goods as iron, coal, and machinery was limited, however, by an inadequate transportation system. The solution to this problem ushered in a new phase of the Industrial Revolution: the age of the railway. The idea of building roads using rails had been around since the early 1700s, when primitive railroads had been developed to transport coal in British mines. But power was still supplied by horses. Then, in 1804, in Wales, an engine was built that moved on rails and by steam power. In 1825, the first public railway for goods and passengers was opened between Stockton and Darlington, and so was born the railway. That wonderful fusion of coal, iron, and steam, and the great consumer of them all. Britain embarked on a vast program of railway construction, financed in large measure by the profits from textiles. The enormous appetite of the railway industry for a wide range of heavy goods solidified the Industrial Revolution. Other industries profited from the advanced engineering and metalworking techniques required for railway building, including the construction of iron bridges, tunnels, and buildings, iron steamship construction, and armaments. Railway expansion provided work for many of the rural unemployed, put employment in general on a firmer basis, and moved the economy forward at a tremendous rate. In 1851, at the Great Exhibition held in London's Crystal Palace, Britain demonstrated to the world its pride in its marvelous machines. The country had truly become the workshop of the world.
For Britain, the next 2 decades were years of almost unbroken industrial and economic growth, while for the rest of Europe, they marked the beginnings of industrialization. In France, the leading nation on the European mainland, industrialization had made some progress under Napoleon, but was slowed by France's slender coal resources, poor communications, and the conservative outlook of its population. Eventually, in the 1850s and 60s, industrialization made rapid headway under Napoleon III, who used the powers of the French government to expand the economy, including creating credit banks for industry and agriculture, building new harbors, and reorganizing the railway system. But France's outstanding industrial achievements under Napoleon III were in luxury goods, such as silks and fashions, carpets and glassware, so that France did not become one of Britain's major industrial competitors. Germany was a different matter. In the 1850s and 60s, it was still divided into many little states, with only a few scattered pockets of industrialization. But the government of Prussia, the dominant German state, had begun the groundwork for industrialization, including laying out a skeletal railway system. After Prussia brought about Germany's unification in 1871, industrialization boomed as science and technology were brought together in a way not yet known in Britain. Germany's steel, chemical, and electrical industries owed much to Germany's university laboratories, and German workmanship owed much to the scientific and technical training emphasized by the German educational system. By the 1890s, Germany had become a major industrial power, challenging and overtaking Britain in a number of important categories.
By the end of the 1890s, the industrial output of the United States dwarfed that of both Britain and Germany. 40 years earlier, on the eve of the Civil War, the American economy was still largely agricultural, although the groundwork for industrialization had been laid. The first factory in the United States, a textile mill built in Rhode Island in 1790, introduced a type of factory organization that was eventually to become the norm throughout the world. The United States put all operations under one roof, abandoning the European craft tradition of having each operation in a separate factory. Another American innovation, and perhaps the country's greatest contribution to the Industrial Revolution, came about to compensate for America's lack of skilled craftsmen. The manufacture of a complicated object, a rifle, was reduced to its separate components, each of which would require far less skill to make than would the whole. This marked the beginnings of mass production, since the parts of all the rifles were interchangeable. Other developments, especially the invention of the steamboat and its use on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, helped the American economy to grow at a phenomenal rate, getting it ready for the great industrialization that was to come during the last third of the 19th century.
As the century drew to a close, the Industrial Revolution was spreading to the extremities of Europe, to Russia, and to the farthest corner of Asia, to Japan, whose genius for copying and improving upon Western technology would make it, in the second half of the 20th century, an industrial colossus. By then, more and more parts of the world, from Asia to Latin America to Africa, would be attempting to industrialize in the hope of becoming more powerful, both economically and politically. Meanwhile, in the older industrialized nations, the course of industrialization has changed once again, this time in the direction of microchips, lasers, and other advanced technologies, which, together, are making possible a new range of machines that are more complex, precise, and versatile than any machine previously known. In the more than 200 years since the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, human life has been transformed. In the century after 1750, Britain itself went from a nation in which most of its 6 to 7 million people depended upon farming for their living to a nation of about 27 million people, most of whom were massed together in urban slums, often built just to house them. Other nations were similarly transformed as industrialization spread to the mainland of Europe, to North America, and to the Far East. Besides the changes within each nation, there were changes in the relationships between nations. As those that had industrialized or were industrializing sought to impose their will on those who had not. Eventually, wherever industrialization took hold, there was a general rise in living standards. just as there was also an increase in pollution and environmental destruction.
The transformation of Britain's economy from agriculture to industry was bound to cause problems, as it disrupted traditional patterns of living. Laissez-faire, a theory developed in 18th century France to limit government control of the economy, was embraced by British industry. As it came to be practiced in 19th century Britain, laissez-faire ranked individual economic interests above national power. The theory was that if individuals were free to act in their own self-interest, competition would become a more effective regulator of economic life than the state could ever be. For industrialists, freedom from government regulation meant greater profits, much of which could be reinvested in factories, jobs, and goods, all of which would, in turn, produce more profits so that the cycle could be repeated.
But for the working classes, the result was generally poverty, hunger, and appalling working and living conditions, since the highest possible profits meant the lowest possible wages. In the early days of the Industrial Revolution, independent hand-loom weavers and spinners, unable to compete with the price of factory goods, were forced into the factories, or more often, into unemployment. In the rural villages, as the poor and unemployed drifted to the cities to look for factory work, craft skills disappeared, and village life became less self-sufficient. Ideas of community spirit and responsibility, which had held villages together through hard times, were non-existent in the new industrial towns, where workers were left to fend for themselves in a strange and brutal environment. Inside hot, ill-lit, noisy, stinking mills, the majority of the employed were often women and children, who could be exploited more easily than men.
If employment was bad, unemployment was worse. The Poor Law of 1834 compelled the unemployed to labor in bleak public factories known as workhouses, where entire families often lived in segregated dormitories. There was no help from the government. At first, it prohibited trade combinations, or unions, to negotiate higher wages and better working conditions. Adherents of laissez-faire refused to blame conditions on the system.
What we are accustomed to decry as great social evils will, for the most part, be found to be but the outcome of each man's own perverted life.
But the conservative British historian G.M. Trevelyan observed,
To leave the workman unprotected by the state as to wages, hours, and factory conditions, while denying him the right to protect himself by combination, was frankly unjust. It was liberty for the masters and repression for the men.
Unrest and suffering occasionally led to revolt. A group of artisans known as Luddites, blaming their troubles on the use of machines, broke into factories and attempted to destroy them. In August 1819, soldiers charged a workers' protest meeting in Manchester, killing 11 people and wounding 400. During the 1820s and 30s, a movement known as Chartism, which held workers to be an exploited class, marched in support of universal male suffrage and other basic rights.
Meanwhile, as the second stage of Britain's Industrial Revolution got underway, the age of coal, iron, and steam, more and more people were employed in mines. They worked long hours underground, in constant danger from flooding and explosion. Children worked in the mines, where, as in the textile mills, they could be paid less than men, and could bring out coal from small, tight places. One child described conditions to a government commission.
I have a belt around my waist and a chain passing between my legs, and I go on my hands and feet. The pit is very wet where I work, and the water comes over our clog tops always, and I have seen it up to my thighs. My clothes are wet through almost all day long.
Some people tried to justify child labor.
Children have mouths and must be fed. If parents are unable to provide these requisites, it becomes necessary that the children should aid in obtaining them for themselves.
But as the new industrial system grew, it needed an increasing number of skilled, able-bodied workers, and gradually began to spread its benefits to fill this need. Pay and conditions in factories gradually improved, creating a new class of independent workers who could better themselves by moving from one job to another. For many working women, factory employment provided an economic independence that they had not known before. New styles of living were emerging. The wealth created by industry allowed a leisured, cultured existence for the upper middle classes, and a more ordered and comfortable life for those better paid workers who could afford to escape from the slums.
Even so, during the boom years of the 19th century, most workers were unskilled and could not escape from poverty. Factories overwhelmed cities with no regulations to control their location, size, or appearance. Large-scale factory production transformed the cities into industrial hives, clanking, screeching, and smoking, sometimes around the clock. Railways slashed through the hearts of cities, bringing noise, smoke, and grit. Factories and railways were given prime land and rights of way, opening great wounds in the urban fabric. Working-class housing, jammed up against the factories, reeked of a filth and foulness hard to imagine today. Few houses had running water or indoor plumbing, and severe overcrowding multiplied the sanitation problems. There were calls for reform, but industrialists were opposed to paying taxes to finance improvements in housing and sanitation.
Eventually, the efforts of middle-class reformers and British workers themselves to change the worst features of the new industrial system met with some success. Although child labor remained fairly common, the 10 Hours Bill of 1847 placed limits on the working hours of women and children. More important, it established the principle that government could regulate industry. With trade unions legalized, workers were able to bargain directly with employers, and owners of factories and mines could no longer ignore their grievances. For skilled workers such as engineers, unions gradually achieved significant improvements in wages and working conditions. Workers also won increased political power. In 1884, most males over the age of 21 were given the right to vote. This broadened the basis of parliamentary democracy and reduced the power of the aristocracy. Industrial cities were brightened by triumphant works of municipal architecture. And the creation of open spaces, especially outside the cities, allowed people the opportunity to escape, occasionally, from smoky, overcrowded conditions. Although working-class slums remained, life within them improved. Municipal water and sanitation services led to better health and longer life expectancy for many workers, as did higher standards of nutrition and better clothing, both of which accompanied higher incomes. In the 1830s, the government had begun to spend small sums on education, and after 1867, a state school system grew rapidly. Meanwhile, private secondary education for sons of the well-to-do flourished at such famous schools as Rugby and Winchester. Painting and literature also flourished. alongside such Victorian innovations as pulp magazines and so-called popular journalism, designed for an increasingly literate working class. But the lot of many workers, especially the unskilled, had not improved. They could not afford to buy the goods that industry offered and had little job security. Destitute and starving people remained a common sight on the streets of cities, and the workhouse for the unemployed continued as a part of industrial city life until well into the 20th century.
In the rest of Europe, industrialization developed more slowly than it had in Britain, but its impact on human life was no less revolutionary. In the end, societies were transformed, creating the same kinds of problems for many, from the silk workers of Lyon to the steel workers and coal miners of the Ruhr Valley. Still, by the end of the 19th century, average living standards in France and Germany were higher than they had been at the start of industrialization. As the 20th century began, Europe's most underprivileged workers were in Russia, where industrialization was just starting, and in the south of Europe, where it had barely begun.
In the United States, a new country with few traditions to be overcome, the impact of the Industrial Revolution was different, at least initially. The large multi-process factory, requiring powerful sources of water power, was often located near rushing rivers in unspoiled rural landscapes. A British visitor, Harriet Martineau, was astounded that workers
have their dwellings and occupations fixed in spots where the hills are heaped together and the waters leap and whirl among the rocks.
The entire United States did not begin to industrialize at the same time. The South kept its plantation economy, which relied heavily on slave labor. Unlike Britain and the rest of Europe, the United States suffered from a shortage of labor. In the Northeast, where industrialization began, American factory owners turned to mass production to solve the labor shortage, making machines, not workers, specialized. In addition, the shortage of labor in the United States compelled industrialists to treat factory workers relatively well in the years before the Civil War. In the first New England textile mills, for example, women and children, who made up a majority of the workers, were paid reasonable wages, while special boarding houses, clean and respectable in character, were built for them. But when industrialization accelerated in the years after the Civil War, conditions changed dramatically. As millions of immigrants came to the United States in the hope of sharing in the wealth being generated, a reservoir of unskilled labor set up a competition for jobs that helped industrialists to keep wages low in factories, mines, and construction. Cities grew at a phenomenal rate. Within little more than 50 years, for example, Chicago grew from this fort and surrounding buildings into this major industrial center. With urban growth came slums, many built, as in Europe, just to house factory workers and their families. As squalor, hunger, and disease spread, so did calls for reform. Significant reforms were won in the years just before World War I, during what is known as the Progressive Era. By this time, the United States was a major industrial power, and its skilled workers had achieved living standards that were the envy of the world. With industrialization, the United States had also become a major military power, able to build a great white fleet and to send it around the world to demonstrate the nation's newfound military prowess, and to use that fleet to impose its will in areas that had not yet begun to industrialize.
This, of course, was something that the industrialized nations of Europe had begun to do before the middle of the 19th century, as they added more and more colonies to their empires. Imperialism proceeded at such a pace that by the end of the century, most non-industrialized parts of the world were either ruled directly by industrialized nations or controlled as economic dependencies, serving as markets for the output of the industrialized nations' factories, or as sources of raw materials for those factories. In Asia, only Japan remained free from European or American dominance, and this was the result of its own successful efforts to industrialize and to copy the West by applying industrial technology to military development. In the 20th century, especially since the end of World War II, many countries previously subjected to the imperialism of the industrialized nations have begun to industrialize themselves. Their success in textiles and clothing, as well as in steel and a few other industries, has often hurt the mature industrialized economies of Europe, North America, and Japan. Their success has also increased the problems of pollution and environmental destruction, turning these issues into concerns of global importance. At the same time, living standards for many citizens of these newly industrializing nations have often increased dramatically.
Meanwhile, patterns of work and play in the older industrialized nations are undergoing new transformations, dictated by the microchip, lasers, and other new technologies which are assuming an ever-increasing importance. Workers in some long-established industries are often replaced by more efficient machines, while employment in new industries requires a new level of training, even for the most routine jobs. Many observers think that the changes being brought about by the new technology will alter our lives as dramatically as lives were altered by the first stages of industrialization. Can you see signs of change brought about by the new technology in your community? Can you see significant changes in the ways in which you and the people around you live?